January 31st, 1945, Clark Air Base, Luzon, Philippines. Major Frank T. McCoy stood in the tropical heat, camera steadying in his trembling hands as he photographed an enemy bomber sitting on the tarmac. The aircraft was whole. Not a scattering of wreckage, not a collapsed frame, but an intact Mitsubishi G4M, tail number 763-12. It gleamed in the sun, a long, cylindrical fuselage, slender wings, and the look that had earned it an Allied nickname, Betty. What McCoy found when he climbed into the wing through an inspection panel would change Allied thinking about Japanese aviation. The fuel tanks, thousands of liters worth distributed through the wings, were unprotected. No self-sealing rubber, no armor, no active fire suppression, only a thin sheet of aluminum between bullets and fuel. 2 millimeters of skin. That single observation explained so much. The bomber's astonishing reach, its terrifying vulnerability, and the human toll embedded in its design. The requirement, range, above all, the story of the G4M begins not with a single engineer, but with a strategic problem. Japan's Navy in the late 1930s faced the Pacific, a vast ocean of islands separated by thousands of kilometers. Planners demanded a land-based bomber that could fly far enough to strike distant targets and return. That requirement forced a brutal arithmetic. Every kilogram saved could be used for fuel, and every extra liter of fuel increased range. Protection, armor, self-sealing tanks, fire suppression, cost weight. The Navy wanted range. The designers wanted to meet the Navy's demands. Kiro Honjo led Mitsubishi's team after Joji Hattori. Honjo, who had studied at Junkers in Germany, and his engineers examined contemporary designs from Europe and the United States and worked through weight budgets with ruthless clarity. The mathematics were simple and unforgiving. Fuel is heavy, roughly 0.8 kilograms per liter. To carry thousands of liters and still meet speed and payload targets, the empty weight had to be kept extraordinarily low. The consequence was inevitable. Protection would be sacrificed for range and speed. The prototype first flew on the 23rd of October 1939. It met or exceeded the Navy's performance targets, speed, payload, and, most importantly, range. Production followed. The Navy christened the type the G4M, and Mitsubishi began building at scale. When war began in the Pacific, the Betty was ready. Opening blows, Clark Field, and the fall of early air power. On December 8, 1941, as the world reeled from Pearl Harbor, 82 G4Ms, along with other bombers, departed Formosa, bound for the Philippines. Clark Field, the principal U.S. airbase on Luzon, was their target. The attack arrived with tactical surprise. The bombers flew high and out of reach of most anti-aircraft guns, then released their loads. Fighter sweeps at low altitude finished the job, strafing surviving aircraft on the ground. In under an hour, American air strength in the Philippines was shattered. Heavy bombers and fighters burned on the tarmac. Lieutenant James Harrington, one survivor, later described the raid precisely. Perfect formation at altitude, then fighters dropping to treetop level to rip apart the field. The G4Ms left intact. Their range had allowed them to strike from hundreds of miles away and return safely. For months afterward, the Betty would be a symbol of reach and surgical first-strike power. Naval shock, Force Z, and the end of traditional capital ship invulnerability. Just 2 days later, Japanese naval air power would prove catastrophic for modern surface warships. On 10th December 1941, G4M and older G3M bombers attacked Force Z, the British battle group built around HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse. The Bettys carried Type 91 aerial torpedoes, heavy, shallow-running weapons with warheads capable of tearing ships open below the waterline. The torpedo attacks were delivered with precision. Multiple hits tore holes in hulls and crippled effective damage control. Within 2 hours, both capital ships had capsized and sunk. Hundreds of sailors were dead, and the myth of capital ship invulnerability to air attack was shattered. For the first time, battleships operating at sea had been sunk solely by aircraft, and the G4M had been the instrument. The advantages and the hidden cost. Throughout early 1942, the Betty appeared everywhere Japanese strategy required it. The Philippines, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, Darwin, and beyond. Its range let Japanese commanders operate from bases Allied forces could not reach or retaliate against easily. It reconnoitered vast ocean distances, struck distant targets, and supported naval operations with a flexibility Allies could not match at the time. But this capability came with an exposed vulnerability. The fuel system, huge capacity, concentrated in wing tanks placed where wing thickness was greatest, maximized range but left fuel mass directly in harm's way. Without self-sealing rubber, thin aluminium skins would leak the instant they were pierced. No armor meant crew positions, and critical systems had little protection from fragments or shells. The G4M's advantages depended on surprise and limited opposition. When Allied fighter strength was sparse or out of reach, the Betty dominated. When fighters could intercept, the aircraft's fate was grim. Turning point: Guadalcanal and the mathematics of loss. By mid-1942, the strategic balance began to shift. Allied fighters, increasingly capable types like the F-4F Wildcat early on, and later F-6F Hellcats and F-4U Corsairs, paired with improved pilot training and tactics, started to contest Japanese air superiority. The vulnerability of the Betty became painfully obvious over Guadalcanal. On August 8, 1942, 23 G4Ms from the 4th Air Group attacked Guadalcanal from Rabaul. American fighters intercepted them over the island. 18 of the 23 bombers were shot down, approximately 120 aircrew killed. Pilots repeatedly reported what they called the Betty's habit of turning into an instant inferno with minimal hits. The nicknames spread among Allied crews: Flying Cigar, One Lit Match, Zippo. The Betty's combustible tendency, the direct result of unprotected wing fuel tanks, transformed it from a formidable long-range weapon into what many Allied pilots considered an easy target once fighters could reach them. Losses continued through the Guadalcanal campaign. Entire air groups were bled white by repeated interception and attrition. What fuel capacity mathematics had given in strategic reach, combat attrition took away in human lives and unit readiness. By November 1942, as the campaign wound down, Betty losses had already passed into the hundreds. Aircrew deaths numbered in the many hundreds as well. The design trade-offs that produced extraordinary range were now exacting an enormous toll. Captured evidence, Booner, McCoy, and the technical revelation practical observation from the cockpit, and wreckage reports painted a picture. But the most conclusive proof came from intact captures. In November 1942, when Allied forces overran Japanese airfields at Booner in New Guinea Technical intelligence teams examined several G4Ms. The accounts matched. Unprotected fuel cells, thin aluminium skins, no rubber compounds, and no fire suppression systems. McCoy's captured Betty at Clark in January 1945 provided the fullest technical breakdown. He and his team dismantled and measured the aircraft for weeks, producing a secret classified report that explained the G4M's exceptional performance and fatal weaknesses. The Model 1 specifications were striking, a remarkably light, empty weight of around 6,741 kilograms, a massive fuel capacity of roughly 4,780 liters in 8 tanks, an operational range exceeding 6,000 kilometers, and a top speed near 428 kilometers per hour. In service, it carried a crew of 7 and could deliver torpedoes or a substantial bomb load. But the fuel tanks sat in the thickest part of the wings, the best place for storage, the worst place for survival once the aircraft took hits. Engineers calculated that omitting protection saved over 500 kilograms per aircraft. That weight went straight into fuel and range. But the statistical effect of that decision was equally stark. Small penetrations in the wing area often led to catastrophic fires and immediate loss. The Betty's vulnerability was not a mistake. It was a deliberate engineering response to the Navy's specification. Strategy, assumptions, and the limits of industrial capacity. Why accept such risks? Japanese military planners in 1937 made assumptions that shaped the G4M's design. They expected operations to be decided quickly, by surprise and initiative, before Allied industrial capacity could turn the tide. They anticipated limited sustained fighter opposition across vast distances. Within those constraints, range trumped protection. But those assumptions collapsed once the war became long and industrial. The United States' enormous manufacturing base could replace aircraft and produce protected bombers in quantities Japan could not match. American doctrine treated trained crews as scarce, valuable assets and accepted the weight penalty of protection to keep crews alive and their experience in the air. Japan could not afford that calculus at scale. By the time more protective variants of the G4M were introduced, Allied air superiority had already made the original model's days numbered. Modifications, too little, too late. Japanese engineers did attempt to mitigate the problem. From March 1943 onwards, limited rubber sheets were added beneath wing surfaces around tanks on some production lines, a light compromise that added only minimal protection and only a small weight penalty. The effectiveness was limited. Small caliber hits could be slowed, but larger rounds and tracer ignitions still resulted in fires. Later, a true self-sealing modification appeared in the G4M Model 3 in October 1944, which reduced fuel capacity and range substantially to accommodate the sealing materials. Only a few dozen to perhaps 100 of that improved variant were produced, far too few and far too late to reverse the operational losses already inflicted on the fleet. High-profile demonstrations, Yamamoto, and the easiness of death. The Betty's vulnerability was dramatized in one of the war's most famous episodes. On the 18th of April 1943, Allied codebreakers intercepted plans for Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's flight. P-38 Lightnings of the 339th Fighter Squadron flew a meticulously timed low-level interception over hundreds of miles of open ocean. When the P-38s reached the Japanese formation, they targeted Yamamoto's aircraft. The lead Betty took hits in the wing area. Fire consumed the bomber, and it crashed. Yamamoto was killed. The operation showcased multiple Allied strengths: signals, intelligence, navigation and timing, and air combat execution. But it also underscored how lethal any hit to a G4M's fuel system could be. The unprotected tanks guaranteed one outcome: death after being struck. The endgame: Okinawa, Kamikaze, and the final missions. By 1945, the Betty's role had shifted. It flew desperate missions, carrying piloted rocket weapons, and later served as transport variants and even in surrender flights. On 21st March 1945, 18 Bettys, carrying the MXY-7 Oka, a rocket-powered glider with a massive warhead intended for suicide attacks, took off in the Okinawa campaign. Loaded with the heavy, drag-producing weapons, the G4s were slow and exposed. American Hellcats intercepted them well before the release point. The entire formation was destroyed, and none of the Oka weapons were launched. One by one, the G4s blew apart and plunged into the sea. One mission ended in the loss of 152 men, bomber crew and Oka pilots together. It was the tragic culmination of what the Betty's designers had feared: great range but almost no survivability against prepared opposition. In August 1945, two white-painted G4Ms bearing green crosses, symbols of non-combatant transport, carried Japanese envoys to surrender negotiations. The same airframe that had opened the Pacific War by striking Clark Field now flew diplomats. The circle closed. Numbers, production, losses, and the human cost: production of the G4M across all variants reached roughly 2,400 airframes. Different sources offer slightly different totals. Some count prototypes and subtypes to push the number a little higher, but the consensus places output in the low to mid-thousands. The Model 1, with the original unprotected tanks, accounted for about 1,172 examples. The Model 2 increased fuel capacity and continued the same vulnerability. Roughly 1,142 of those were built. The Model 3, the only version with true self-sealing tanks, appeared very late and in small numbers, perhaps 60 to 90 aircraft. Transport conversions, G6M, added a few dozen more. Those production figures, however, tell only part of the story. Loss rates were extreme. Few Bettys survived the later years of the conflict. Attrition, fires, and interception destroyed the majority. Crew casualties were heavy. Thousands of Japanese aircrew perished in G4Ms across the campaigns. Exact totals vary in sources. What is incontrovertible is the scale. An aircraft designed for reach became, as many surviving Japanese airmen would bitterly remark, a machine that demanded the highest possible price in human lives. One former flight petty officer summed it plainly: the Betty was a magnificent aircraft that asked us to die for its range. We flew it because we were ordered to fly it. We died in it because that was what it was designed to make us do. Contrast with Allied design philosophy. Comparing the Betty to contemporary Allied bombers reveals a philosophical divide. U.S. heavy bombers, notably the B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator, accepted substantial weight penalties for protection. Armored plates shielded pilots, armored bulkheads protected crew positions, and self-sealing tanks were standard. These measures increased empty weight by thousands of kilograms in comparable types, but they drastically improved survivability. U.S. production capacity allowed those weight penalties to be absorbed without crippling output. The strategic calculus differed. Allied doctrine valued the retention of trained crews and fought to keep men alive. Japan's earlier calculation prioritized immediate capability that would pay off under conditions of surprise. American wartime analysis confirmed the practical benefit. Protected aircraft returned at higher rates. Crew fatality rates from chest wounds and fires were dramatically reduced, and overall mission effectiveness improved because surviving crews could fly again. Japan's lack of industrial margin and the original requirements that prioritized range meant they could not replicate that model on the same scale. Engineering choices, ethics, and the lessons of design. The G4M story is not simply a technical footnote. It is a lesson in engineering trade-offs and the human consequences of design priorities. Honjo and his team did exactly what their brief required. They produced an aircraft that could meet the Navy's range and speed targets using available technology. The design was brilliant in the sense that it solved a hard problem within specific constraints. But those constraints were themselves choices about the value of crew life versus operational reach. When the broader context of the war changed, when sustained opposition and overwhelming industrial capacity entered the equation, those earlier choices produced catastrophic results. By mid-1943 and beyond, Japan could not reconfigure its industrial base fast enough to replace losses with better protected aircraft in the quantities needed. The incremental fixes arrived too late and in too few numbers. The Betty's aircraft, once feared and respected for their capabilities, became symbols of attrition and sacrifice. Final image. From strike to surrender. The last chapters are starkly symbolic. The bomber that opened the Pacific War by destroying American power at Clark Field on December 8, 1941, ended the war carrying surrender delegations in August 1945. Its white paint and green crosses transformed a weapon into a vehicle of diplomacy. That transformation captures the full arc of the G4M, an instrument of strategic reach, a breaker of naval illusions, and ultimately a machine whose most lasting legacy is measured in the lives it consumed and the lessons it taught. The Mitsubishi G4M Betty was a machine of extremes, unmatched range for its time, exceptional speed, and an ability to shape early campaigns across the Pacific. Yet that same performance was purchased with the lives of thousands. The Betty's story forces uncomfortable questions about military design choices, the ethics of risk and survival, and the cost of pursuing capability at the expense of protection. In the end, it was not simply an aircraft, it was a mirror, showing how strategy, industrial power, and human values collide in the furnace of war.